we're talking about addiction and trauma, the way these two interact is that trauma overwhelms the nervous system. Addiction serves the purpose to try and soothe the nervous system.
How much trauma or childhood trauma plays a role in addiction? The crux of childhood trauma, I believe, is that as a young child, they even talk about being in the womb,
Gestational trauma.
suffering trauma through your mother.
Whether things are good or bad for us, we are drawn to what's familiar. And for a lot of people, moving towards addiction later in life can be something that is familiar to them as well. A lot of people feel this grave sense of shame and guilt over their behaviors and their experiences. And one of the things that I try to encourage is to develop a sense of curiosity around the behavior, right? What is the motive? Let's get away from the subjective interpretation of good behaviors and bad behaviors. Let's try to better understand the motive behind the behaviors. Because most people aren't bad people, right? Like, we're sick people trying to get well.
Hi, Josh. Great to have you back, buddy.
Thanks, Marv. Good to see you too.
Yeah. So I know last episode we discussed a lot about addiction, the roots of addiction, dopamine, how that played a role, how we thought that most of addiction was a genetic component. As I do more research and I think about things, I find myself asking questions as to how much trauma or childhood trauma plays a role in addiction. I think I undersold it last time, and I think that it has a much greater role than I thought it did. So I wanted to kind of back up and kind of discuss trauma related to addiction. I'm sure you've done a lot of it, or a significant amount in your practice.
Something I see a lot.
Right.
So when you talk about trauma, it's a word that I think sometimes doesn't fully grasp the reach of what it really means, right? So people think trauma, they think a violent act. They think something catastrophic. They think physical abuse. People don't realize that trauma could be a little more insidious than that, right? So a lot of things that happen over a long period of time, the death of 1,000 cuts, right? Growing up in a home with regular neglect, growing up being bullied, right? Growing up in a home where a child was often criticized, growing up in a home where a child was not really allowed to express themselves, a home where a child, anytime they made a mistake, they were ostracized. Once, twice, not a big deal. You repeat this behavior over and over again. It takes a toll on somebody's nervous system, right? And when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about something, an event that overwhelms the nervous system. When we're talking about addiction and trauma, the way these two interact is that trauma overwhelms the nervous system. Addiction serves the purpose to try and soothe the nervous system. And that's kind of where we see the overlap between these two, and it's really common.
So when you first meet a person struggling with addiction, how early in the process do you start looking for trauma as the cause of their addiction?
So more often than not, especially when I'm first meeting a client, a lot of that information starts to present itself just by doing my initial clinical interview. Usually I don't even use the word trauma when I'm first meeting a new client. I try to understand a little bit about their life, how they function, how they cope with life, a little bit more about their family, their background, their friends. As far as what substances they may or may not use, I try to get a better understanding of their insight as to what purpose that substance serves for them, right? How it helps them to change the way they're experiencing their emotions. For some people, they're really anxious, right? So if you're really anxious, you may use a substance that is a bit more depressive. If you're in a state of hyperarousal, using things like alcohol, right? If you're constantly in a state of emotional pain, you may be inclined to use opiates, right? They don't just work on physical pain, they work on emotional pain. And on the flip side, somebody who's often depressed or dissociative or kind of down, may be more inclined to use stimulants. So a lot of the information that I will start to gather over time will start to tell the story of what kind of trauma there may or may not be. But it's a dance that takes time. It's delicate. You don't just go in there like a doorbuster trying to break it open. Because the truth is, a lot of people don't even understand that their experiences can be deemed to be traumatic, right? If it's not an overt event, such as, being physically hit or, being in a dangerous situation, a gunshot, the day to day traumatic events that somebody could have experienced over the course of their life is something that a lot of people just kind of normalize as like, hey, this is my life. Like, it could have been better, it could have been worse. This thing kind of just happened to me. They don't really see it as trauma.
So, how would you link trauma and addiction to someone who's never heard of it before? Meaning that they would say, I'm addicted. So, what does that have to do with trauma? I don't have any trauma. What are you talking about?
So, as I would continue to get to know the client, I would start to educate them and help them become aware of certain patterns of behavior that they may engage in. So, for a lot of people, again, the difficulty to calm your own nervous system, right, could be an indication of trauma, could be an indication of anxiety. I'm not really sure, right? As I get to know you better and build trust and learn more about your history, your past, your vulnerabilities, your sense of self and identity, I will help the client start to make these connections for themselves. But a lot of it starts with awareness and education, right? A lot of people who are chronically in a hyper aroused state, right? I have clients who are A students, overachievers, hard workers, but they are almost constantly on edge. They don't see it that way, though. They just see themselves as high functioning, high performing members of society. So I will work with them to help them see that, some of those habits serve them well, but really where do they come from and how do they really deal with these things when they're, not producing, right? Like if I'm not doing something, if I'm not active, if I'm not working, I'm struggling with a sense of self-worth, right? And how do I learn how to sit with that versus, oh, I just need to do more. I need to keep myself active. I need to produce.
Right. It's kind of, I guess they talk about the difference between inferior shame and grandiose shame, where grandiose shame would be, I didn't feel worthy, so I have to be perfect. I have to strive for more, right? I have to be great at my job. I'm going to make more money. I'm going to show you that I'm better. Where inferior shame is, I'm no good. No one loves me. I'm just kind of just sulk here and sink into a hole.
Sure. So I would, to expand on that, when, even just the subject of shame is really interesting when I start to work with clients, because working through shame is a cornerstone of helping people heal from trauma. Shame is a creative adaptation, actually. Shame is something that people develop younger in life that help them to survive situations that otherwise would be perceived as insufferable. So a kid growing up in a home where parents are often, absent or emotionally dysregulated, right? Kid growing up in a chaotic home. Now, a child, it would be really difficult for them to believe, a helpless child who's dependent on their caregivers, to believe that they are in a constant state of danger and that they have no control over this situation. So the way a child internalizes this is that they start to blame themselves for the chaos in the home. So I now believe that if I do the right thing, if I say the right thing, if I don't do that thing, that I will be okay. Right? It's a way of learning how to preserve myself. So shame is actually something that is very functional at one point in time. And part of the work is educating clients to understand this so that they can start to develop a new connection with themselves and sort of rediscover themselves while also developing some compassion for themselves and some of the difficulties that they now face later in life, which at one point actually served them really well.
And I guess when we talk about trauma, there's realized trauma and there's unrealized trauma, right? There's also big T, they call it little t, right?
Sure.
Big T, some divorce, death in the family, violence, things that are imprinted in your brain that you can't kind of get out. Little t are obviously you came home from school after being bullied and your mom says, suck it up, you're fine. Didn't want to hear you, didn't want to acknowledge your pain. So thus having those repressed feelings and having to internalize them and actually adapt and change who you are authentically, because that's really the crux of childhood trauma, I believe, is that as a young child, they even talk about being in the womb.
Gestational trauma.
As far as suffering trauma through your mother, right? Because when a mother is stressed, her stress hormone levels go up, right?
Sure.
And what does that do to the baby? They undergo stress as well. So they're already undergoing stress before they were born. So a person can grow up with what they seem to perceive as a normal childhood, yet they suffered trauma that they were totally unaware of.
Yeah. What you know is what you know, but that doesn't mean that it was normal, right? It's just all that you knew.
Right.
Right? Growing up in a house with constant yelling and screaming. Growing up in a house where a child is being parentified at a young age because one of the parents are completely absent. Right? Growing up in a home where you are constantly compensating for the chaos in the home by trying to be the perfect child, overperform tasks, right? You learn that you can keep the family intact as long as you minimize family conflict. So let me minimize whatever conflict there might be by helping clean up, by doing well in school, by, people pleasing, by doing all of the things. And here we are, right? That's just normal.
So if we had to take a guess, obviously there's different opinions. And my opinion is kind of changing. How much of addiction is rooted in trauma as opposed to addiction rooted in genetic predisposition or, or is it a combination? Pardon me. Or is it a combination and obviously involves multiple factors, right? Because so often there's a circle and then this is the trauma circle and this is the addiction circle, right? How much of an overlap is there? And there is an overlap. I read books. I've read Gabor Mate.
Sure.
He thinks that all addiction is because of trauma. Basically, all of it. I don't know how much of that I believe, all, but I think it's a significant portion.
So I don't believe that any of this stuff happens in a vacuum. So when you talk about multiple factors that overlap, I do believe that to be true. Not everybody who struggles with addiction has a history of trauma, but I would say the great majority do, whether you want to refer to it as little t or big T. It's something that I see quite a lot. But genetics certainly play a role, environmental factors play a role. On the same time, I would say that the environmental factors could also play a protective role, right? In people who may have certain traumatic experiences, but don't find themselves turning to addiction, right? Because they had strong social supports, because they had healthy connections, because they were taught other healthy coping skills, right? Because they learned healthy expression.
So basically, I was just going to ask that question that you partly answered. There are two people. Why, with the same traumatic events, one has an addiction and one doesn't? And I think you answered that question. You said because they had a caring adult who supported them through that event. They were emotionally soothed and seen. And they worked through that event where the other person had to internalize everything. Thus, later in life, develops the addiction, right? Because he gets older, he or she gets older, and they reach for whatever substance or behavior.
Whatever they could find to self-soothe.
Right.
That's really what it comes down to.
Right. And like you said, if you needed soothing, you chose alcohol. If you wanted to get rid of the pain, you may be choosing opioids.
If you grew up in a chaotic home, right, you can try to seize a sense of control with an eating disorder, right? If you grew up in chaos, gambling, right, is a way of reenacting that chaos. For a lot of people, later what you see between, trauma and addiction later in life as things play out is that people as human beings, one of our fatal flaws is that whether things are good or bad for us, we are drawn to what's familiar. And for a lot of people, moving towards addiction later in life can be something that is familiar to them as well. For a lot of people growing up in a home where I worked with a sex worker once upon a time. They grew up in a home where they were, over sexualized, sexual abuse was part of their life. And yet you would think, okay, so now this person is working as a sex worker, right? An over sexualized kind of work. For them, part of why they found themselves in this way is because when they were younger, right, a lot of the sexual abuse that took place was not something that was in their control. It's not something that they gave permission. They didn't feel a sense of autonomy. Now, later in life, whether or not they realize it, part of them is reenacting some of these sexual interactions, but they're trying to play the ending out differently, right? Because they're assuming the role of being in charge here. They're telling you what you can and cannot do. They feel a sense of power. So when you start to understand trauma a little bit more and how people function, a lot of the times we're not even aware of some of the things that we're doing or how they connect to our trauma or how they connect to our childhood. But the body and the brain does have a natural tendency to want to correct an experience later in life.
So, yeah, like you said, sex, because maybe they lack connection and they feel that being hypersexual, they're going to get a connection that they didn't have.
Sure.
Right?
Or it's the only way that they know how to form a connection, right? There was never true emotional, vulnerable intimacy,
right.
But they were able to connect and bond with people through sex.
Right.
Bonding is a natural instinct.
Same, I guess, with work. You workaholic, kind of validate themselves as well, right? Yeah. Addiction is the choice of a wounded person, man. Not a bad person.
No.
But society, most of society, looks at them as being bad.
And a lot of times in counseling sessions, a lot of people feel this grave sense of shame and guilt over their behaviors and their experiences. And one of the things that I try to encourage is to develop a sense of curiosity around the behavior, right? What is the motive? Let's get away from the subjective interpretation of good behaviors and bad behaviors. Let's try to better understand the motive behind the behaviors. Because most people aren't bad people, right? Like, we're sick people trying to get well.
Yeah.
As you may know, as we talked about last time, right? So understanding whether it's with drug and alcohol use, it's with trauma, right? How this affects the brain, how this affects the nervous system. So the amygdala, right? The fear factor response center completely is haywired, right? So now we're in a perpetual state of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. The prefrontal cortex kind of goes offline. That's the part of our brain responsible for decision making, planning, emotional regulation. Our hippocampus, right, the area of our brain responsible for helping us with memory formation, becomes kind of foggy. And this is kind of where we get into the bit of understanding that when people are either activated in their trauma or lost in their addiction, their brain is literally not firing and working the way your brain and my brain work. So really, at the end of the day, they're just trying to help regulate their nervous system, but they're not even able to think consequentially about their behaviors.
Right. So basically, when you are traumatized by a traumatic event, those neural pathways are strengthened. And later in life, you reach for that substance or behavior because it soothes that part of the brain that was neglected. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So how many people in recovery would you say, or people that you see say, I'm not traumatized, man. I just like to party?
I would probably say half. And I would say maybe more than half of those are just not really attuned to their own experience in life. Again, whether you want to categorize it as big T, little t. But again, trying to confront a client about whether or not you believe they have trauma is really counterproductive. As you continue to build a rapport with the client and learn more about them, learn more about their use, learn more about their why they use, learn more about their perceptions of the world, how they see themselves, how they see others, you learn more about their family of origin, the dots kind of start to connect for themselves. So it's really more about a pacing experience to help people get to a place to better understand that maybe trauma is a part of their story and they just don't realize it.
So would you tackle that person differently who has an addiction related to trauma as opposed to an addiction not related to trauma?
Sure. Yeah, very much so. Really important that clients who struggle with both addiction and trauma see a therapist who's equipped to deal with both fronts. Because if somebody who struggles with trauma and addiction only sees a therapist who can work with addiction, they're kind of like white knuckling their way through the experience because you're really not dealing with the battle on both fronts because the two are enmeshed. They're intertwined and both need to be dealt with. Otherwise, you're going to see much higher rates of relapse. People who have untreated trauma, when they're triggered, are much more likely to have higher rates of relapse in their use. So you do need to deal with both simultaneously if the client is to have the highest chances of healing.
Are there any particular therapies that are better for one or the other?
Sure. So, as far as trauma work, there are a few different ones. I use a couple. There are many out there, not all of which I use. So, EMDR is one. So, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. Without going into all of the technicalities of it, when dealing with people's trauma, sometimes asking them to retell their entire story, even in of itself, is just a way of re-traumatizing the person, right? So EMDR is a modality that gets used to try and address past traumatic events and memories in a way that's not as activating. So through active eye movements, right? You're keeping a client engaged where their eyes are moving back and forth, or through, little they could wear headphones, they could hold little vibrators in their hand. Basically, the idea is bilateral stimulation. So you're keeping the client activated in some sort of movement while they're being asked to reflect on a particular memory linked to this traumatic experience. There's actually not a lot of talking that goes on behalf of the client. The best way to explain it, the way that it was explained to me, as far as understanding how EMDR works when it comes to dealing with trauma, you and I, let's say we, had a nice dinner, I don't know, 3 weeks ago, right? We went to a steakhouse. You and I, we could sit here, we could talk about it, we could talk about the environment, we could talk about the food, we could talk about the noise levels, right? We recall the experience for it to have been pleasant, right? But it feels like it's something that happened a couple of weeks ago. It feels like it's something that had passed. For a client, when they are asked to recall a traumatic event or experience, internally, they almost start to re experience that on a visceral level, right? So there's this phrase in trauma called body keeps the score. Your body doesn't really forget the event, even if it happened 5 years, 10 years, 20 years ago. When I will start to talk to clients about certain incidences where, they were bullied, or an incident with their mother, or a time police were called where no physical violence was committed against them, they can feel their body being reactivated just by talking about this. And sometimes that's where people get stuck. So EMDR tries to think about trauma almost in a way where, like, there's this memory that you had and this experience that did not get fully processed. So EMDR is an attempt to try and help them reprocess that experience without overactivating them. And it is something that is considered evidence based. It's something that's supported by insurances. It's something that has been shown to work with PTSD. So it's I don't want to say it's the gold standard, but it is one of the better standards that is used in this day and age when it comes to dealing with trauma. There's also something called somatic experiencing. So to go back in referencing my phrase of the body keeps the score. So there's a psychiatrist, Basil Vandercook, I think a doctor, Dan Levine. I forget the name of his book off the top of my head, but he has kind of written the book on somatic experiencing, which basically references that your body has this stored energy from the traumatic experience. So what the practitioner trained in somatic experiencing does is tries to help you and your body to learn how to release that stored energy. So if you ever see somebody, right, people who like flinch, right? Like if they hear a loud noise, like they flinch. Why are they flinching? Well, the truth is, again, through uncovering memories at some point, like you may come to learn that like this is what would happen. They would actually get hit on their head by their parent. Or you'll see, and I believe Peter Levine shows this in one of his videos. So he's working with a vet who went through a couple of tours and, lost a handful of soldiers along the way. And you'll see certain movements and experiences that almost mimic the protective actions that he took during the course of, different explosions to try to protect himself, right? So like the body literally does remember this. So you try to help the person work through these experiences by releasing this stored energy. Cognitive based approaches, right? So you want to help people develop more cognitive flexibility, right? So issues around shame that a lot of clients struggle with, right? You want to help normalize the shame, right? You want to help them recognize how adaptive the shame was as far as the work that you're doing with them, so that they don't just go to this place and continue to, hate on themselves, rag on themselves, beat themselves up when they start to get activated in this shame, right? You want to help them build a different narrative around the shame that they're experiencing.
So let's talk about that shame versus guilt, right? I guess guilt is I did something bad, and shame is I am bad, right? Where you really need to get down deep into the shame, because in addiction, abstinence doesn't equal recovery,
For sure.
right? Abstinence equals not using the drug or behavior, but recovery is picking up your life. Right?
Yeah.
So how do you make them realize between the guilt or the shame? If let's say they say, I feel so guilty about doing one thing or another, and then you tell them it's not the guilt that you're feeling, it's the shame. How do you make him realize the connection so that was a traumatic response? That was the shame was the response to the trauma, thus leading to the addiction.
Sure. I mean, a lot of it comes down to holding space for a conversation. Sometimes people, you ask them a question and then they give you a flat answer and they think that's the end of the questioning and they think that is it, right? So using a method of like Socratic discourse, right? Just continuing to ask why. All right. I'm a bad person because I stole money. Why'd you steal the money? Because I needed drugs. Why did you need drugs?
Right.
Because I was feeling sick. Why were you feeling sick? Because you were withdrawing, right? So really, were you doing this because were you a bad person, or like understanding like, no, you were sick. And then again, helping them to come to understand the psychoeducation around what happens to your brain, right? When it is essentially hijacked by an addiction, why you act a certain way, why you behave a certain way. So helping people learn how to almost hold space and be a bit more compassionate around some of these feelings of shame and recognize that it's something that they experienced, but it's not necessarily who and what that they are, right? A lot of people get stuck in this narrative and this over-identification with the feeling of shame, when in reality, they barely have much of a sense of self at all. So when it comes to recovery, right, as opposed to abstinence, sometimes it's about approaching more existential questions, right? Like, who am I? What am I? What are my values? How do my actions exhibit those values, right? How do I help this person rebuild their life? How do we get them reconnected to things that interest them and drive them and excite them? Because their life has essentially been hijacked, right? So the truth is they don't really know who they are. This is just how they behaved in their addiction.
Trauma is messy, man. And everyone's got trauma. Everyone. I mean, I say that.
Well, when you say that, what comes to mind for you, if I may ask? What does trauma look like for Mark?
That's a question that needs more than this conversation right here to answer, man. But, you think about it because you never really think about it, right? It's like it gets buried.
Mm-hmm.
And then the more you dig, the more you will dig up. And the more you'll say, wow, this is why it's happening. And I think the key to recovery is from an addiction related to trauma, especially, as well as probably anything else, is to kind of analyze like, why am I feeling this way, right? And you have to sit there in these uncomfortable, painful thoughts. And typically, in most cases of addiction, they bypass that sitting uncomfortable part. And they reach for the booze, the pills, the coke.
Because they have no tools, right? So
because it fills that emotional void.
And a lot of recovery, whether it's healing from trauma or addiction and or trauma and addiction, right, is recognizing that people need to be empowered with the tools to learn how to better regulate their nervous system, right? So that's where using different grounding techniques, breathing techniques come in, right? That's where using certain mindfulness-based strategies comes in, right? Learning how to regulate my nervous system out of hypervigilance. And that also only can happen when people feel safe, right?
Vulnerable. You have to let yourself be vulnerable.
And you gotta feel safe before you're going to allow yourself to feel vulnerable.
Right. And you have to know that other person that you're speaking to is not going to judge you and criticize you and belittle you and sweep things that you say under the rug, right? Which is pretty much the case in most family relationships. When you're speaking to a therapist, that's a different story. And that's why I believe why are the relapses so high? I mean, there's a lot of relapse.
So, we're fortunate that our brains are plastic, right? That change is essentially always possible. But like developing any new habit, it's really difficult. It takes time, right? People need to be taught and given space to learn how to sit with discomfort. And the reality is, no recovery that I've ever seen in my years of practice has ever been linear, right? Recovery looks like the stock market. If you ever follow that trend, it constantly moves up and down. There are good days and bad days. You can have several good days and then one terrible day, right?
Yep.
What's the saying? The market, it takes the stairs up and it takes the elevator down. And for a lot of people in recovery, that happens.
Well, it's escalator up, elevator down.
Or escalator up, whatever. Yeah. I apologize. Thank you.
Believe me, I know the elevator down part all too well. Anyway.
But again, helping people understand that like relapse is normal, right? Like as your brain continues to rewire until you develop new connections in your life, you develop and you strengthen these social supports, you start to trust that things will get better with time. People may still get overwhelmed along the way. A relapse is not failure. Usually a relapse is an opportunity to learn. I try to frame a relapse as a wonderful learning experience as far as, okay, what didn't work here? What can we take away from this scenario? What did we learn here? Is this a scenario need to avoid? Are these people that are not really serving you well, right? What emotions are coming up for you that we need to better work on and learn to cope with that drugs are able to, that you're struggling to do for yourself?
So if what you're talking about, if I feel, wow, this may be me, man. Okay. What are the first steps that you would tell me to do?
First steps?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sitting here and all of a sudden a light bulb goes off and I'm thinking to myself, I have trauma. And this is, and I deal with it in such and such a way.
First thing that I would tell you is that you are not alone. This is much more common than people realize. And I will always tell people that sometimes, your flaws are also your assets, right? So it's not because you've had these experiences that things are always all bad. And that if it is something that bothers you and something that you need to work on, that it is absolutely possible to address. And that's where you maybe seek professional help, right? Maybe you talk to somebody in your family, right? Like maybe you learn more about it. But there are many tools out there for people to utilize to help address this stuff, right? Awareness is step one, right? You're in the game once you start to become aware of these things. Then you just need to learn how to be willing and be open and be honest with somebody else. But that takes time, right? Because a lot of people who have a history of trauma, more often than not, struggle with trusting people, right? Authority figures were inconsistent. There are issues and fears and feelings of abandonment that may come up. It may be difficult to connect, right? Difficulties with intimacy and being vulnerable. So it can be challenging at first, but healing is absolutely possible.
Yeah. Do you have, in your own experience, a success story about trauma and addiction that was like really successful?
Yeah, I mean, I see it happen all the time. I can think of a girl who I no longer, well, a woman who I no longer work with, that initially came to me because she was really struggling remaining in the same unhealthy relationship after the same unhealthy relationship. And drugs and alcohol were part of her story. Eventually came to me because she was just so overwhelmed by the situation and by the circumstance. And when she came in, she talked more about some of these unhealthy relationships. We learned a bit more about her substance use. We learned a bit more about her childhood, right? So this person was also an overachiever, was also a people pleaser, grew up in an alcoholic home, right? So issues here, right? So people pleasing, the need to perform, issues around abandonment, and codependency, right? So codependency is a theme that we see a lot in homes where there is addiction, and it goes all kinds of ways. In short, codependency is, I struggle to be okay unless I know that you're okay, right?
If I'm okay, you're okay.
If you're okay, I'm
I'm okay.
right? I can't be okay without you being okay. And that's totally oversimplifying it, but
Right.
for the layman's explanation, that's what we'll start with.
Mhm.
So this client of mine often found themselves in relationships with other men who often had drug and alcohol issues, right? This was something that was familiar to her, even though this wasn't good for her, right? Because it's what she grew up with. A lot of these people were emotionally unavailable, very similar to some of the dynamics in her home, right? This person was the overachiever. So they were always working full time, coming home, cleaning, like carrying all of the responsibility of the house, cooking, trying to do everything to make things work, often availing herself in ways, physically or sexually, like basically doing anything and everything she could to please her partner because she was fearful of conflict. She was scared to say no. She was fearful that he would leave. So she had fears of abandonment, right? So all of these themes that we kind of just touched on, like all of these sort of like sprinkled in a bit. So by having them come in and starting to build awareness around these things, by getting into support groups and building social supports and learning that some of these things she was not alone with, by slowly stopping to drink, by slowly learning how to set boundaries for herself, by dealing with a lot of the shame and learning and helping her understand how it served her, but it no longer does serve her. She was able to eventually get out of that relationship. She was able to get sober. She was able to, in fact, move away from her family, which was relatively toxic, and build a new life for herself, and I haven't talked to her in a while, but I hope she's doing well. And that's just one case,
Yeah.
You see a lot of that stuff, and it's beautiful to watch. It's a blessing to be able to bear witness to.
And it takes a lot of work though.
Years in her case.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is hard work.
So as far as the addiction goes, how do loved ones approach someone who has an addiction? Gingerly and in a loving manner, so not to ruffle their feathers, so to speak.
So a little ruffling is likely inevitable, right? It's important. And the reason I say this is because a lot of the times parents, right? I'm going to use the example of, parents with their kids or, adults with their spouses. There is this fear of conflict and explosiveness just by bringing up the subject.
Defensiveness.
Defensiveness will probably come into
Yeah.
play. So usually the first thing I will say is to express to a family member that there's some things that you've noticed that, have you concerned, that you care and love them, and that you're wondering, if anything's been going on, like how are they feeling or anything that's bothering them. Maybe they're open to discussing some things, maybe they're in complete denial. But then you can also express to them that, like, these are some of the behaviors that I've started to notice. These are some of the things I've started to see change, right? The way that you've been taking care of yourself, right? Or showing up late for work, or, these intense mood swings, right? Starting to just point out the things that you're observing that are really not debatable, right? At the end of the day, denial is going to be the biggest challenge for any loved one or family member when dealing with their partner over this subject. And sometimes that's going to be part of the battle at first. One of the things as a caring member of the family that you don't want to do is you don't want to enable.
Enabling.
Because enabling is part of what perpetuates the cycle. It's part of what perpetuates the behavior.
So how do you avoid enabling, but still provide the support that's needed?
So you recognize, and again, sometimes this is where you seek support groups. Sometimes this is where you speak with a professional to understand, where have I been enabling, right? So as a parent, you might be enabling with money, right? You may know exactly how much your kid spends or needs as far as like food or going out, and draw a healthy line of what you're willing to give them financially, right? So you don't want to support the habit, because usually the habit can't always be supported without finances, right? You let them know that, like, I'm happy to buy you food, I'm happy to take you out, I'm happy to support you in this way, but I don't feel comfortable supporting the habit.
So, but the addiction can kind of roll over and turn into something criminal, right?
Sure, it can. And so setting healthy boundaries is really important. I think the hardest things for parents to deal with is the concept of tough love. So I can't tell you how many times I've had situations where parents have bailed their kids out of trouble, whether it's legal trouble, issues with money, issues with friends, and not allowing them to deal with any of the consequences of their actions or behaviors. And that is usually one of the cornerstones of not enabling and allowing your child to really experience some of those consequences for themselves.
Yeah. The issues also is, how do family members and loved ones protect themselves emotionally from what's going on, right? That's so difficult.
It is. And family members often need as much support as the people who are out there, right? There's a phrase in Al-Anon, right? The 3 C's you might have heard of before, right? I didn't cause it. I can't control it. I can't cure it.
Yep.
Right? So kind of knowing my role in this, because people who are in active addiction can be really manipulative. They can tell you that things are your fault, right? They can make you feel a sense of responsibility. They can make you feel guilty, right? And learning how to be steadfast in your decision and knowing what your role is in loving this person and supporting this person, and knowing what your role isn't in enabling this person. And that takes trial and error. That is not easy.
And I think as far as recovery goes, obviously we spoke about AA and therapy, but I think, the problem in our society is that there's so very little to promote healing, right? And so much that undermines it, because society wants us to be addicted. It truly does. It wants us to be addicted, and it wants us to stay there.
Mm-hmm.
And what type of tools can we use? We discussed AA, but how do you get someone, right, to AA and to realize, they say that, rehab is those for the people who want it.
Yeah, not the people who need it.
Not for the people who need it.
Sure.
Right. So how would you?
I mean, listen, I know we keep referencing AA. Just to be clear, there are many other recovery support groups that exist out there, whether it's Smart Recovery, Refuge Recovery. Some people prefer, non-denominational. Some people, who don't necessarily believe in God and a higher power, right? They need to find other outlets as far as their solution. But to help people, I think a lot of this also goes back to some of our earlier conversations of understanding what is addiction, what is going on in your brain, what feeds it, what perpetuates it, and what lifestyle actions or behaviors do we need to start to substitute or replace it. Right. So I know last time we talked a little bit about like a dopamine detox and recognizing the importance of doing that when you talk about society wanting us to be addicted, wanting us to be, inundated, overstimulated. I think most people these days, especially where we live in a pretty densely populated part of the country, in the Northeast, most people are overstimulated, right? Most people don't know that they're overstimulated. Most people don't know how to regulate their nervous system. A lot of people don't know how to relax. So when you are trying to teach people these things, right, we're trying to give them new tools to cope. That's a big piece of it, right? We need to introduce them to new people, new social supports, new circles, right? People who are of similar mind and body that understand some of the themes that we're touching on and are collective in wanting to support each other to work against some of those things. Because now we're not just talking about addiction anyway, right? We're talking about much more than that.
I think obviously you have to try to get people to become their authentic selves, right? And so much about, we call it the disease. So now, is it a disease? Is addiction a survival strategy and not a disease per se because there's a genetic predisposition? Is it both? It's a complicated topic.
Sure.
And in reading books and listening to people and my experiences, it's not one thing. One person will say it's one thing. The other person will say it's another thing. It's genes. It's not genes. It's trauma. It's, I just want to party kind of thing. I think what we can kind of surmise is that becoming your true self is something that was lost along the way, from the time of your birth until the time you started using substances or the behavior.
Yeah, I mean, even just sitting with a client and sometimes posing the question, like, who would you be without your addiction? Right? It manages to touch every part of your life.
The addiction it teaches you who you really are. Your addiction, when you're in recovery and you've recovered truly, you've found your authentic self, because that was being masked by the addiction.
Yeah, you never really knew the answer, right?
Right.
This is the process of recovery, is self-discovery,
Right.
right?
Right.
What are the things that I am doing with my life now that I have all of this space and time to do them, right? Now that using isn't my main preoccupation. Now that I have the freedom to think about life, now that I have the flexibility to do things and try new things out and not have this dependency that sort of keeps me enslaved physically and mentally.
So what keeps a person in recovery and prolonged recovery versus someone who relapses and falls back into their addiction? What would you say is the number one or the number two thing that they are so aware of and they do diligently to keep them in recovery? Not abstinence, right? Because we said there's a difference, but recovery, meaning their new life.
I think for a lot of people, I don't know that I have a single answer to that, right? But people who are fortunate enough to find a passion and drive in life and recognize that that is something that they will lose if they decide to use or pick up again, I would start right there, right? Even just becoming aware of the consequences, right? So for a lot of people, usually ground zero is where they finally admit to themselves that there's just no world where they can have a healthy relationship with any particular substance or choice, that no matter what, the second that they choose to re-explore that avenue, they remember that whether it takes a week, a month, several months, or a year, that like their life is likely to become unmanageable at some point again.
So how do they prevent the triggers?
I mean, a lot of ways, right? Depends different. So different stages of recovery, right? Like 3 to 6 months of recovery will look different from 6 to 12 months. 12 months to 24 months looks different from that as well, right? The more time initially that you put between yourself and the last time you used, the less frequent and the less intense those cravings are. But the biggest piece here is, now that I've taken this substance out of my life, what have I replaced it with? What have I filled my life with? Right? So have I filled it with healthy eating and healthy sleeping? Have I filled it with exercise? Have I filled it with friends and family? Have I filled it with a fulfilling job? On a day-to-day, how do I feel about my actions? Right? Am I doing things that I feel esteemed for? Right? For most people who are in active addiction, they feel pretty low self-esteem and low feelings of self-worth. That's pretty much true across the board. So my day-to-day actions, are they esteemable? Are they making me feel good about myself? Right? All of these things become a factor. Exercise, right? Learning how to find tools to manage when my emotions start to feel difficult. What do I do with those? How do I cope with them? Did I learn to journal? Did I learn to call a friend? Did I learn to exercise? Did I learn to listen to music? Right? How about understanding my body and certain triggers, right? Another acronym, HALT, right? Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. For a lot of people, those can be pillars for an opportunity for relapse.
Boy, that sounds like me every day.
And it could be in reality, right? Like learning how to take care of myself. Like when you're in active addiction, you lose touch with your body's natural biomarkers, right? You don't understand sometimes that you're feeling lonely, right? So the second you ever felt lonely, you got high, right? If I was ever feeling tired, you know what I did? I went and did a bump. I didn't go sleep, right? I didn't recognize that. When I was hungry, I didn't understand it as hunger. right? I just went ahead and found something else to use that totally suppressed my appetite. So even just developing an awareness of your own body and these markers, right, is a way to learn how to stave off triggers, right? Learning other psychological or mental tools, right? So one of them's play the tape out, right? A lot of people, when they think about using or getting high, they're already engaging in something that I would call euphoric recall. They're thinking about how the last time I drank or I used, I felt okay. This feeling went away. And they may not be wrong, but they're only watching a clip of the tape. So what happens after you do that? Right? Well, generally I don't just have 2 drinks, I have 4. Well, then what happens? Well, then I don't really sleep well. Well, then what happens? Well, then I'm kind of irritable when I wake up the next day. Well, then what happens? Well, then my craving and my obsession for another drink actually becomes stronger and more pervasive, right? And then the cycle begins again. So next time you think to yourself, oh, like a drink might help me feel better. Yes, but what else will it do? Right? So another tool, right? Another thing when your nervous system gets activated, grounding tools, right? Breath work, cold plunges, exercise, meditation, going for a walk in nature, right? One of the things people in recovery don't realize is that feelings are not facts. They fade with time, right? The transient nature of everything that we experience. As human beings, right, we can be like butterflies. We can flutter for a day and think it's for a lifetime. But really, anything you've ever felt, Marv, you and me both, has come to pass with time, right? So you teach people how to do a little, urge surfing, right? Give them little blocks of time within 5 minutes, within 10 minutes, within 15 minutes, usually within 20 minutes. Most of those things have generally passed.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'm not, listen, if
most
you're
part, yeah.
actively using and you're going into withdrawal, like, no, the craving to use is not going to pass in 20 minutes.
Yeah.
You need a higher level of care, right? And in cases like that, that's where MAT comes in handy, right? Medication assisted therapy, right? So things like Suboxone, right? There is a therapeutic use for it.
Absolutely.
When someone comes to you, or maybe you have a friend or someone in your circle, and they say, like, I don't have a problem, right? A lot of people say, I don't have a problem, like I can control it, but it's clearly on the brink of a problem. When does it become a problem? It's a sliding scale, right, for everyone. So, like, what would you tell that person that says, I don't have a problem, but from the outside looking in, you're on the verge of having a problem, or you do have one and you're not aware of it?
Sure. So
do we want to put this in?
Yeah. It'll be loud enough to.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
So to answer that question, sometimes I will get really like basic with them, right? So in our field of, I know I'm looking at you because I'm answering the question.
Okay.
I know. We use something called like the DSM, right? The Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which basically has like every physical mental health condition anyone could ever have written in a book. And within it, under certain, diagnoses, right? So SUD, like a substance use disorder, right? There are markers that you need to hit in order to qualify for having an issue. I will simply walk this person through some of that information and ask them, is this true? Is this true? So I will ask about tolerance. Do you understand what tolerance is? Yes, I understand what tolerance is. Needing more and more of the substance to get the desired effect. Okay. What do you drink now? What you used to drink? Okay, so we need more to get high, right? That's basically what it is. Okay, great. Do we understand the concept of withdrawal? Okay, well, let's talk about withdrawal. Do you understand what that is? How does that work? Okay, all right, great. We're all just making sure we're all on the same page here. All right, so is there an increase in a desire to use, right? Just obsession, like thinking about it. Are you spending more time preoccupied thinking about this substance or trying to procure it, right? Yes, no, maybe. All right. We're just right. These are not accusations. These are just truly objective questions, right? Next thing. Have any of your personal or professional relationships suffered as a result of this? Have you been late to work? Has your work been as high quality? Has it been on time? Have you had any issues with any friends or family recently? No. Okay, yes, maybe. We'll see. All right. Um, have you had now this is a piece that I think is sometimes questionable, but I will still raise it, right? Like whether or not you've had any legal issues. Because a lot of people can say no. I haven't, right? But the reality is statistically more people drive under the influence than those who actually get, prosecuted for it. So you don't have any DWIs. How many could you potentially have? Do you ever drive or operate a vehicle under the influence? Right? Do you find yourself more tired? And again, right? So just going over the car thing, do you find yourself feeling a little more tired or is it more difficult to function in the morning? Right? Have there been any other areas of your personal life that have suffered? Has your diet changed? Has your weight changed? How about your mood? Right? So you kind of just go through these markers. And if somebody's in denial and they say no to these questions, even though you know the answers are yes, because somebody will be like, no, nothing's going on at work. My boss is a dick. He's such a hard ass whenever I come in late, right? It's my boss's fault, right? I should have never been pulled over for that DWI. Like, that's ridiculous. It was a speed trap. Literally, there were 4 cops waiting at the exit. It was a speed trap. Okay. Right. And aside from this, there are little questionnaires, like real simple questionnaires that I could give them that have a scoring table that I could look at it as well. So the reality is, it is pretty easy to spot and acknowledge, but depending on the level of denial that the person is dealing with, it may be difficult to have a conversation, which again, as a friend or a family member, usually the easiest way to start is not really with an accusation of like, you have a problem, but hey, I'm really worried about you. I loved you, but I have noticed these things, right? Like when we're going out, I noticed that you have been drinking more. I also noticed that you've been a bit more irritable, right? I've noticed, you look like you've lost some weight, right? I kind of see the bags under your eyes. Usually you look really clean, kept, and put together. Now, looks like you're kind of slacking, right? Your activities of daily living seem like they're rough, or, you haven't, your place looks a mess. Usually you keep it immaculate. What's going on? Or falling behind on bills. Are you having money troubles? Where's the money going? All of these things, you've been complaining about A, B, C, and D. These are just some of the things I've noticed. And I don't know if you're aware of them. So I just want to point them out to you as somebody who cares about you and loves you.
Right. And it all depends now how that person's going to take it. Are they going to say, you're out of your mind, man. I'm fine. There's nothing wrong with me. I drink once in a while, dude. I drink. Okay. When I drink, yeah, I'll have 6, 7, 8 drinks, but I only do it once or twice a month. Maybe 3.
And have you been blacking out? Because
Yeah, I blacked out once or twice, but we were doing shots with the guys and I overdid it. Yeah, it just happens. So,
do you think it's dangerous to black out?
Well, I don't know. I mean, not necessarily. I think if you black out once or twice, what's the harm? So
No
this is
harm.
what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
So this is what you're dealing with.
Sure.
All right. Most of the time.
And so with this, so one of the primary modalities that you work with in counseling, right, is something called MI, or motivational interviewing, right? So people come in. Sometimes they don't always even think they have an issue, right? Sometimes they're coming in because maybe their job is making them because they had an incident at work. Maybe their spouse is making them. Maybe their parents are making them. Maybe the school is making them, right? So the stages of change, right, with motivational interviewing, right? So pre-contemplation, Yeah, I'm not really sure why I'm here. Right? My wife has, I'm here to appease my wife.
I don't have a problem.
Okay, well,
Kind of a thing.
why
Yeah.
does your wife want you here? Why don't you tell me about that? Oh, what happened? Oh, there was a fight, or you made a fool of yourself at a family event, or you lost your temper. Okay. Yeah, it sounds unfortunate. Is this the first time that's ever happened? Most people do not come in because it's the first time it's ever happened, right? What other alcohol related incidences have you have? Let's take a look at your drinking, right? And like, again, we just start to ask more questions. We start to plant seeds where it's like, listen, obviously drinking's affecting your life. You're here because your spouse wants you in counseling for it. It's undeniable. So, so you're saying that this is your wife's problem. She needs to be more okay with your drinking and that she's overreacting because you're blacking out and that you are embarrassing her in front of her family. That's her problem. I'm confused.
Right. Yeah.
You know?
I think, you know, for the most part, a lot of people who relapse, they go to therapy, they go to AA, they go through the steps, and then they come out and they relapse, which is part of the recovery. And they say, you know, when you do go relapse, that you have a belly full of beer and a head full of AA.
Yeah.
Right? Meaning that, yeah, you're drunk and stoned, but you realize every single thing that you did. Okay? And you can acknowledge it and you can connect the dots now where before AA, okay, it was actually pleasing to get stoned. After AA, when you got stoned, it wasn't as much fun because in your head, you had the AA. Right?
Yeah. With the goal is AA or, it ruins it for you.
It ruined it. It ruins your high.
You ruined my high, man.
Right. You ruined my high, man. I went to recovery and it ruined my high. But again, trial and error, after once, twice, three times, those who do recover, it sticks.
Yeah.
And those who don't, it doesn't. And
listen,
they get sick.
It's a fatal disease, right? People die.
Yeah.
There's just no way around
Absolutely.
it. Absolutely. That's why this is serious.
Yeah. Yeah. So Josh, once again, great to have you here, man.
Pleasure, man. Thank you.
Always provide an interesting conversation. Like I said before, this will be a recurring theme in my podcasts. And I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks for coming. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your expertise. I'm grateful.
I appreciate you, Marv, and all that you do, man. Have a great day.
Okay. To everyone, till next time, stay well and God bless.